Alright, so this video is going to be on Shaddolls and the impact that they will have on the TCG meta. I did say I was going to do this a while ago, I think, but I've been testing a lot both with and against them, and I think that now I'm at the point where I understand how it will impact the game enough to be able to comment on things like that. And of course, I may be wrong and whatever. I'll go into that, but I basically think that Shaddolls are nowhere near as good as the internet makes them out to be. And if you look at like my view history, basically I just typed Shadow into YouTube and watched pretty much the first 2 pages worth of videos, and everyone's like, oh, it will be tier 0, it will be the new best deck, it just destroys everything. No, it really doesn't, and I barely think it will be tier 1, let alone tier 0. It will be a good deck, it will be in the meta, but not even the best deck, let alone the best deck by such a distance that it eclipses everything else. So I'll explain why I think that, the Japanese meta, or the OCG meta I should say, is just a lot different to the TCG one, which would go in some parts to explain why the deck is really such a huge threat in Japan, and that just won't be reciprocated over here in my opinion, and just various other musings. So we'll start with the fact that the deck is just full of inconsistencies. Like, building it is itself just so hazardous. There are so many dilemmas and paradoxes in building the deck and taking into account how the deck runs. So firstly, there's the light problem, in that Nephilim is the only proactive fusion because it lets you send a shadow from the deck to the grave when it's summoned, and is generally a threat with the fact that it's 2800, even though it has no protection like Midrash does. It is 2800 and does swing over things very easily. So you do want to summon Nephilim, or Construct, or whatever its TCG name is, but you have to run Lights in order to accommodate that, and Lights just don't have any synergy with the Shadow deck. And there are various Lights that you can run, but all of them have their own problems. So you run the Chaos Dragons, so White Dragon, Wyver Buster, and probably one Black Dragon Collapse Up, and if any Black Dragon Collapse Up. And but the thing with that is it increases your cloggy hands in the early game, and by the early game I mean the very immediate first turn, and they don't really do a whole lot. I mean, yes, they float, but they have a propensity to be dead in hand. Like, me and Kariko Kamachi did a lot of testing with the Chaos Tengus, we call them, throughout various stages in various decks, and unless your deck can accommodate them, in that it supports level 4s and really makes use out of the floating effect, and can mitigate the fact that to draw multiples means that they're very dead in hand. If those things aren't in place, then they can increase your inconsistencies. I think maybe they are the best of the options potentially, but I don't think that they really do a whole lot. I don't think they have a whole lot of synergy. It's just that they float to a decent extent. Of course, Eclipse Wyvern you can use, but that is only at 1. I'll get into that when I talk about the OCG trends, but I wouldn't recommend running Eclipse Wyvern in this side of the hemisphere. And then there are Light Swans. A lot of people running Light Swans. I don't see any point in running Light Swans because none of them really do anything. I mean, Felice is good with Mathematician and whatnot, but Felice, if you draw it, it's the purest -1 if you draw it. So Felice is essentially just a power for consistency trade-off. You gain that ability to make some plays, but it's at the expense of your consistency, because if you draw it, then not only does your deck lose that same proportion of power, but it also means that you have a -1 in hand in a deck that already has a fair amount of -1s in hand just by way of how it works. But I'll get onto that. So Felice is a power for consistency trade-off. Then Raiden, on the other hand, is the complete inverse of that, and that is nowhere near as good a tuner as Felice is, because Felice special summons itself for free. Raiden, you have to normal summon, and then it doesn't gain a plus in any way. So you just run it to mill, and even if you do synchro with it, cool, it's a level 4 tuner, but it might as well be a level 4 vanilla tuner, because milling doesn't actually do anything. And then like, oh, it's light, it's a tuner. Like, you might as well run any light tuner by that logic, because Raiden doesn't do anything. It mills, but you're running the light swans just for milling, basically. Raiden, you go -1 when you synchro, so you lose the power of Felice, but you gain consistency in that. It's not awful to draw, even though it doesn't do anything. Lila's effect isn't that great. I mean, MST isn't that good at the moment, so why would Lila be that great? And Raikou is probably the best of the light swans, but it's too slow, just by means, like, the fact that the deck is filled with flips, you have to set them and then flip them, means that Raikou exacerbates that problem of having to normal set things. Raikou would be the best one, but in general, milling is unfavorable. Otherwise, you'd run Curry Bandit, because Curry Bandit is the best of the mill cards, because it actually digs you into fusion. It digs you 5 cards into fusion. For that reason, I would potentially even think of running Curry Bandit, even though milling is for the large part unfavorable, just because it digs you into fusion quicker. But even then, a lot of people aren't running Curry Bandit, and for good reason, because randomized milling is not effective. So if randomized milling is not effective, why would you run Light Swans? And the Light Swans also increase your normal summon dependency, which is already a huge problem. So the Light Swans aren't good. Majesty's Fiend just doesn't suit the deck, which is sad, because Majesty's Fiend is still an amazing card. One of the best cards out there, really, at the moment. It shuts down many decks, but it just doesn't suit with the Shadow strategy. And I don't know what else. Vela isn't the sort of thing you'd run in multiples, because it isn't good. It isn't good at the moment. I mean, you might run it as a one-off, but even then, it doesn't do a whole lot. It's just worse than Breakthrough Skill, and even Breakthrough Skill isn't that great at the moment. It's okay, but Breakthrough Skill is more of a solid one-off than Effect Vela is. And Rainbow Karibo doesn't really do anything when it hits the grave. It's just more useful when it's in the hand. AD Changer is just gimmicky. Like, there are all these replacements to try and substitute Electromagnetic Turtle, which don't really work that well. So the lights are all bad. They don't have any synergy, so that's a problem. Then another problem is the fact that if you run more monsters in the deck, then you're gonna have all monster hands, which is bad, because the deck is so slow in setting the monsters. Like, you can't actually use the monsters. You only get your normal summon set. You're not going to special summon any of them. It's only if you have the fusion spell that you're actually going to do anything with the Shaddolls in your hand. So let's say you go set Hedgehog, because Hedgehog's the only one that you're going to set on the first turn, realistically speaking. You set the Hedgehog. Then any other Shadoll in your hand at that point is a -1. So because of that, you should run less Shaddolls. But then if you run less Shaddolls, you run out of them very quickly. As in, like, after 2 plays, then you're out of Shaddolls, and your deck ceases to do anything. So that in itself is a contradiction. And then you run, because of the fact that Hedgehog is the only good first turn set, because you don't want to risk setting Lizard in case they summon a floater, like a real floater, and run over it, and then the Lizard doesn't do anything. Or conversely, set Dragon, like, what's a turn 1 set Dragon gonna do? Except if they summon Midrash and attack for some reason. And Falco is only good if you have facing the Shadow set. So because of that, Hedgehog's the only one that you're already gonna set first turn. It means you have to run Mathematician or Armageddon, but probably Mathematician. And Mathematician is very good because it isn't a randomized send, it's more Foolishes. So you get to specifically choose a Shadow to send from your deck to the grave and then do that. But it, again, increases your normal summon dependency, which increases the extent that you'll have -1s in your hand at various points throughout the game. If you have multiple Mathematicians in your hand, then you summon one, the other one's a -1, along with all the other Shaddolls that are -1, along with Shadow Beast, until you can actually use it as a -1, along with any other tribute monsters that you have that make it -1, etc. And then you can't run enough protection because the engine costs so much space. You have to find space for supplementary cards, additional lights, protection, and the deck desperately needs protection because Midrash doesn't do anything. Like, you summon a Midrash, so what? So what? It has 2200 attack, which means that anything plus Lance runs over it. Which I've already said run Lance. You should be running Lance in most decks at this point. If you Midrash dies to anything plus Lance. D Prison is now at 3. Prison is a very good card this format, just because of how slow the game is. Midrash comes to that. People looking at breakthrough skill and things like that. Like the fact that Midrash is so brittle that all these back row, just like generic back row, it isn't specific back row, just these generic back row manages to deal with it. And then suddenly everything becomes relatively obsolete because you invest in the Midrash. Granted, everything will float, so you use Shadow Fusion into the Midrash, and then whatever, you'll get your floaty effects. And then the Midrash itself may float, but so what? So what if it floats? Like, the Shaddolls don't actually do anything, because most of them, firstly, are reactive. The only ones that have proactive effects are Falcon, Hedgehog, and Beast. Beast is just draw 1 most of the time, so great. Like, it isn't bad, but it isn't good. It's just draw 1. Hedgehog lets you add 1, which in this case isn't even that great. It lets you add a Shadow monster when it's sent to the grave. Isn't even that great because most of them don't do anything. And Falcon is okay if you have the things in the grave, but in the early game it's incredibly slow. I mean, the deck just has a very, very slow early game unless you have the fusion. And even if you have the fusion, you make Midrash, it doesn't do anything against most things. Like, really doesn't do anything. Like what I'm at a loss as to what the deck actually does that is so good. And you're like, oh well, it wins in OCG. Yeah, it wins in OCG for several reasons. Firstly, because they have things that we don't. Mainly, they have Dad at 2, the Star Seraphs, and Heavy Storm. So Dad at 2, I don't know whether it came first or second, but one of the final builds in Japan for Shaddolls played the Chaos Dragon, Engine, Eclipse Wyvern, and Dark Armed. Now the thing with Dark Armed is that with Dark Armed at 2, you can afford to play Eclipse Wyvern and things like that, because you can run 2 to 3 Eclipse Wyvern, and then you always have the Dad to search out. So that becomes a very potent early game play. And the thing with Dad is that it reduces both your normal summon dependency and it reduces your inability to deal with established fields, and it deals with the fact that your early game is slow. It deals with all of these things, and it creates a little soft lock in that if you have Dad and Midrash, the opponent is more pressured to deal with the Midrash because they can't just go like set D Prison end. They have to actually try and do something, but then the Midrash prevents them from special summoning monsters more than once per turn, which would be the means of dealing with Midrash and Dad. So Dark Armed is very, very good in Shaddolls, but not when it's at 1 because you'll never see it. So at 2 you can actually base the strategy around Dark Armed in a manner that makes it good, and solves many of the problems with the deck. The Star Seraphs is just a very good light engine, which means that the whole dilemma of having to run bad lights doesn't exist. And Heavy Storm's probably the most significant thing because players in OCG aren't going to set more than 2 max, which means that you using Dragon as a fusion material, just sending it, is going to get you a lot more value than it would now when you hit 1 of 4. And there are going to be less outs to Midrash, because in that sort of setting, back row, less back row decks are more of a common thing. So it makes sense that Shaddolls are doing well in Japan, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will immediately translate itself here. I'm gonna have to stop because I'm approaching the 15-minute mark. Like I could talk about this all day. There are so many reasons why Shaddolls won't be as good in the TCG as people think they will. I would summarize it as the deck, in terms of deck building, is full of contradictions and inconsistencies that create problems for you as the player, both in trying to build the deck and in playing. And then even then when you play, your early game is incredibly slow, and so what if you summon a Midrash? So what? It doesn't do anything, and the ways in which you float don't do anything. All of your cards are weak, so they just get run over. Yeah, I guess that'll be my summarization of it for this little excerpt. So, yep, thanks for watching. They'll still be good, but just won't be tier 0. All this tier 0 nonsense has to stop, please. please has to stop.